So I want to welcome everybody to Mission Alive's Innovative Church conversation today that we're going to have with Mike Breen. I'm going to let Mike introduce himself here and kind of tell you his history in a minute. But Mission Alive is a church planting and discipleship ministry. You can learn more at www.missionalive.org. For those of you that are on the webinar with us today, please use the chat function as Mike talks to us and put your questions in there, and I will call upon you to unmute yourself and ask your question in the midst of it. So with that, I am going to shift and just, Mike, if you would you kind of kick us off and just share with us your spiritual history, kind of go back to your upbringing and kind of training and churches you've worked with, and kind of just give us a bit of a bio of your spiritual history.
Yeah, I mean, the simplest way to tell that story is to say that as a young boy and as a younger teenager, I really had no knowledge of God. I had no connection with him. And to all intents and purposes, it was just a kind of happy English pagan household, which is quite a common reality. The vast majority of people in England have no connection at all with a kind of a professed faith. And that's largely due to the way in which the history of the church and the history of the leadership of the church has failed the population over the last 100 years or so, particularly after this First World War. But at about the age of 16, I began to sense that I wanted to be a slightly different person. I wanted to be a person that was kind of more capable of doing good things. And my guess is that that's the kind of the work of the Spirit beginning to just influence my heart towards the things of God. And it was just around that time that God saw fit to send an American missionary to our school to teach the religious education class for one term only. So it was just for, I think, probably 3 months. Miss Demarest lives in Denver today. She's a delightful old lady. Bruce Demarest is a member of the faculty of the Denver, the Denver College there, and he was finishing his PhD under F.F. Bruce in Manchester, England, and that's where I lived. And she came, and the principal of the school was a Christian, even though it's a state school, and so she did amazing stuff. She used to talk about the second coming of Jesus, and it was really cool. We loved it. And I said to her one time that I felt somewhat incapable of having a proper debate with her because I didn't have enough data, enough information. And so she lent me a Bible. Now, what she didn't know was that although I was a bright lad, I had dyslexia. I was dyslexic. And so the Bible was the very first book I ever read from cover to cover. I never read a book up until that point. And I'd gone through a strange thing that sometimes dyslexics go through, where your brain gets rewired in the kind of middle years of teenage, which I think is something to do with the hormones or something. My own opinion is that God saw fit to do this compensating work in my brain. And as most dyslexics will tell you, they can read, but they don't read with the same part of the brain as everybody else does. And in fact, neuroscientists say that that's actually the case. And so sometimes when I'm tired, it's like I can't read again. It's so funny. But I began reading the Bible. It had a reading plan in the back. it said if you want to read the Bible in a year, then it's 3 chapters a day and 5 on Sundays. I couldn't think of any reason why I wouldn't want to do that. So I just did that and became a Christian by myself. And I didn't know that it was called that even. I just was a believer in Jesus by the time I got back to school after the summer vacation.
Mm-hmm.
And I spoke to some of the Christian teachers at school, and they said, well, go to church with us. So I went to church, and that was at the age of 16. And at the age of 18, I was in seminary studying to go into the ministry. And so I've been doing this a long, long time. And most of my early work was done in under-resourced urban environments, mostly amongst de-churched and disenfranchised young people. And then in particularly under-resourced communities that had seen specific urban issues like racial tensions and poor housing and infant mortality and all of those kinds of things. And it was there that my wife and I learned not only how to family, but learned all of the basic components of the missional life. Mm-hmm. And it was there that basically I began to write and to teach other people the things that I was learning. And so many of the things that people encounter from the work that we've done together really came out of those early years. So that's the kind of the story of the beginning. We went to the States for a little while as a kind of a recovery period from all of the work in the inner city, and then was called back to Sheffield in England, where we saw a remarkable work of God, raising up a church that became the largest church in Europe. Mm-hmm. And spawned a kind of missional movement that continues to touch the world to today. So after that period, we kind of handed it over to the leaders that we'd raised up, and we moved to the States and wrote some books and started all the things that people have heard about over here.
Yeah. So what was the church in Sheffield like when you got there?
It was an evangelical church. It had a kind of a renewal movement experience. But had tried to reach the Generation X kind of group of people who wanted to deconstruct church or wanted to deconstruct things in general. And that led, not because of the deconstruction, but because of the way that leadership operated, to an abusive environment, which became a huge scandal in the Church of England. And it was around that time that I took on the task of that church. So it's a bit of it's a bit of an uphill task initially, kind of working with that. But they were very open. They were very sweet and humble. And so we began to reach out principally to college students and then to other young people, and saw this remarkable thing begin to happen.
Hmm. And I've heard you speak, any number of times, of course, both in the learning communities as well that you did at Pawleys Island years ago, as well as at a lot of different conferences. I've heard you speak, mm-hmm. and I've heard you talk a lot about the discipleship, and now what you were learning about discipleship sort of started there at Sheffield. Can you go through that? Like, what was it that you were learning as you were witnessing what God was doing there at Sheffield?
Yeah, well, I mean, as a good evangelical, of course, my assumption was that if people had more knowledge, that greater access to good biblical information, they would become more effective disciples, defined as a person that's growing in Christ, who's able to make disciples. So a person that is a disciple who's able to make disciples. And like pretty much every other Western pastor, my experience was almost the exact opposite. And so we began to dig much deeper into the work of discipleship, work that had begun before Sheffield in all of these inner city communities, where we recognized that the 3 components of really empowered discipleship were information, imitation, and innovation. So it's necessary, of course, to have a knowledge of the scriptures. It's, of course, important to have a knowledge of the gospel. It's important, of course, to have access to scriptural truth because of course that's the thing that sets us free. But we have to always remember that truth is a person, and that person is a person whose life is available for imitation, and the access point to that life that we imitate are other believers. And so the patterns of imitation needed to be, first of all, explored and then kind of codified and ramified, because, I mean, really, there was nothing available. There was nothing other than maybe The Imitation of Christ by Thomas à Kempis, which had been written maybe 600 years previously. So there really wasn't much there. And so we began to look at when in history and which leaders had seen significant movements of discipleship. And of course, we looked at the early work of the Great Awakening here. We looked further back to some work with Augustine and the early church fathers, even back to the Desert Fathers. But I think principally the work around the Moravians and the early Methodist movement was the thing that really helped us to see some models that we could use. And so we began to kind of dig into those scripturally and begin to apply those. And in many ways, what we did was a kind of a reinterpretation of those models for the contemporary era.
Over the years, you've spent some time in the States. I know you're pastoring in a church in Ohio right now.
Yeah.
Spent a fair amount of time with American Christians, American churches. What have you noticed about American Christianity that would be helpful for Americans to realize, by way of comparison from, your own experience?
Well, I would say I've been here for 17 years, and I've been an American national for 3.
Congratulations. I didn't know that.
Thank you. Yeah, I tell everybody I'm a South Carolinian, and they can tell by my accent. Yeah. And of course, they all think that's funny, but I am a South Carolinian. That's where I became an American. When I first arrived here, what struck me was that some of the forward-thinking pastors were beginning to see this, but the majority of leaders and pastors had not really grasped this, but were beginning to feel it, which was what had happened in Europe was inevitably going to happen in America, which was decline in church attendance, decline in obvious vitality, the kind of simple markers of vitality in the church, and the commensurate decline in culture, corporate culture across America as a whole. And what I sensed God was saying to me was that I'd learned how to grow tomatoes in a desert, and that I was going to one day be able to teach other people how to grow their tomatoes in the desert, because the desert was coming. And over the last 17 years, of course, we've gone from, 2004. If you look at the statistics that were just released by The Economist last week on the growth of the largest religious group in America, the Nones, and Nones. You see that from the year 2004, overall church attendance and the growth in the Nones has been, meteoric. To the point where now, for the first time in recorded American history, as far as the church is concerned, we have a minority of people who identify with church attendance or church membership. So it's 48% now for the first time in American history. So what that indicates, and I said this when I first arrived, I said, the cultural earthquake has started. All of the indications are that we're going to live in the aftershocks of those. And if you live in an earthquake zone, you have to learn that, first of all, people become very suspicious of buildings. And of course, the analogy that I was drawing is that people become very suspicious of institutions that seem to be collapsing with the cultural earthquakes that are successively seen. And what we've seen, of course, is that people have become disillusioned by politics, people have become disillusioned by financial systems, and people, of course, have been disillusioned by the institutions of the church, which have not only been shaken, but have collapsed. And if you've been in an earthquake zone and talked to people who've been through earthquakes, they'll tell you their idea of going back into a building is something that grips them with great fear and great anxiety. And that the majority of the people that I encounter who would be categorized as nons or, some other disposition towards the faith would be people who I would identify as those who are suffering the cultural PTSD of successive cultural earthquakes that have shaken institutions to the point that they look dangerous. And, I think that that's the reality of it. I think that most of those nuns look at church leadership as, if not always abusive, tending towards abuse, and that the system itself as being not only unhealthy, but deeply destructive. So this reality, I think, for America is something that has emerged over this last couple of decades. And I would say that reality is something that I'm very familiar with because that's what I was born into as an Englishman. And that's maybe why the Lord sent people like me as missionaries here.
As you look back over your years of ministry, what do you know now that you wish you had known when you were younger in ministry? Maybe not going all the way back to your first ministry, but somewhere midway in your ministry. What do you know now you wish you had learned 20 or 30 years earlier?
I think the issues of power balance and radical equality and how they relate to the process of evangelism would be the things that I would be most interested to have learned earlier. So, for instance, I've just started a Bible community on a Sunday evening with a group of Gen Zennials who have no connection to organized church in any way. And what we say there is that no one's allowed to introduce any information to the text that's not in the text, because we want to always maintain a power balance so that it's a community that's based upon what we see in the text now. What I would say is what God is speaking to us in the text as it stands. And of course, I'm an expert in all of these things. I've been a theologian all my adult life. I'm a missiologist for most of it. What I've learned is that it's important for me to become an expert in the curation of an ecosystem that maintains a power balance. So of course, it's great that I'm an expert in other things, but the thing that I want to be an expert in, and the thing that is most important for me to be an expert, is the ability to cultivate, to care for, and to curate an ecosystem where power balance is maintained. Because in doing that, what I've seen is that people discover that God will speak to them, is speaking to them, and therefore will reveal himself. And that the spiritual feudalism of the Western church that says the feudal lord owns the spiritual property and provides for the spiritual peasants, whose task is to do the same thing that all peasants do, which is to maintain the metrics of feudalism, which is how many peasants do you have and how much tax do they pay. Those two metrics no longer become valid or important because there's no feudal system that's needed to be maintained.
So let me tell you what I think I hear you saying, and you tell me how far off I am, okay?
Yeah, yeah,
I hear you saying that you're gathering with this group of young adults,
yeah,
and rather than bringing your expertise to the explanation of Scripture, you're all approaching Scripture based on just what you read in the moment, and everybody is being asked, what is this saying to you? And that whatever they're hearing it say to them is equally legitimate, at least from an experiential standpoint.
yeah. And then what we do at the end of the time is, I mean, from a biblical historical point of view, we create a midrash. They just call it free forming, where I just take all of their ideas, all the stuff that they've got, all of the things that actually I believe that God has been speaking to them, and they're amazing things. And I just write them up on a whiteboard, and we all photograph it and share it on a shared text. And it's interesting at the end, because obviously we're using methodology from the Discovery Bible strategy. Well, we get to the end of it, and I say to them, okay, so what do you feel like you're going to do about this?
Mm-hmm.
And it's amazing what people are saying. They're saying things like, well, I think God is doing miracles all the time. I'm just not noticing them. So I'm going to spend my week looking for the miracles so that I can be more aware of God's presence. Mm-hmm. I mean, are you kidding me? That's amazing.
Yeah. Yeah, I wondered if I was hearing a little DMM.
Yeah. It's all DMM. My problem with DMM, I don't have a problem with DMM. But the thing that I wanted to look at was, is there a way in which I can contextualize this amongst people who want to function in a community that's larger than two? And is there a way by doing that we can see a more scalable process of movement building? Mm-hmm. And so that's what I'm experimenting with right now.
So what would you say to church leaders that are, say, of the older couple of generations that want to reach out and connect with younger generation, either Christians or people that have some curiosity? What one or two changes in thinking do they need to experience in order to be able to do that?
Well, I mean, if they want to do it, they will be able to, because the Spirit of God, of course, will help them. And the Spirit of God is the one who helps us with metanoia, because what you're saying there is that they're desiring metanoia, but they're desiring repentance. So they're desiring a change of mind. I mean, one of the things that I'm doing with leaders in the huddles that I do online and face-to-face is basically coaching them in how to do this. Because if it was easy, everybody would be doing it, obviously. So I'm not belittling it or suggesting that it's an easy thing to do, but I think we can learn it. And I think that the first thing to do is to begin gathering people's stories. Now, what I mean by that is, as you live your life, you can live your life as a kind of butterfly consumer going to a whole variety of different places, so that you go to, 5 different gas stations and 4 different grocery stores and 12 different coffee shops. Instead, I would recommend that whatever the economic downside, that you just go to 1 or 2 of those places and begin to develop relationships. And the way that you develop relationships is to ask people about their story. How you doing? What's going on? How's your week been? Just and what you do by doing this, and this is something that's a deeply valued process within social anthropology, within missional contextualizing work. What you're doing is you're gathering the biography of a community. You're gathering the collective biographies of a community. And what that will do is begin to give you a picture of who it is that God's called you to reach. It's very, very hard to be able to share the good news if you have no understanding of what the bad news is. And, the bad news for a Jew was different to the bad news for a Greek. I mean, I get it that the bad news is defined by the fall of Adam and the loss of that place of grace, of course, but it's contextualized differently in each culture. And so we need to understand what the bad news is so that we can begin to craft the message of the good news. I wrote a book called Speak Out, just in this last year or so, that kind of helps people with this process, which is about private and public communication of the gospel. So that process, I think, is enormously important. But the first skill is to listen to people's stories.
Yeah, I want to remind the rest of you guys, be thinking about questions you'd like to ask Mike and put them in the chat window, and I'll call on you here in a few minutes. So Mike, let me take you back just in your own journey. What have been some of the difficult points of ministry, difficult points of decision that you have faced in your many decades of ministry, and how did that all play out?
Yeah, I think difficult places have generally occurred when I felt the necessity to go in a particular direction, and other people didn't want to do that. So a little bit like Paul and Barnabas. Barney wants to take John Mark along. Paul's going, I've forgiven him, but I don't trust him. He's a staff that he's going to break under me. So those kinds of situations are very, very difficult because they're very hard to process, because there's so many emotional connections. There's so many deeply held values and feelings that are connected with those kinds of decisions. So those are difficult. And, I've seen lots of those down through the years. I think that the other thing that I would say is a kind of deeply complex thing. I may have to move out of here because it looks like the swim team have just arrived. And can you hear all of that in the background?
Yeah, we could hear the background noise. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll move. Let me move. I think the other thing is the desire that I've wanted to develop, which is in the people that I've worked with, and that is the desire to build a non-expert culture, a culture that's not defined by experts, but that's defined by a desire to be kind of collaborative and built around equality. And so that often is quite a complicated thing. The Western model of leadership is a competency model. Mm-hmm. And so in general, the way that works is you develop competency until you become an expert. And then once you're an expert, you kind of reach the zenith of what it is that you're looking for. And what that does, I think, is it tends to put a cork in the bottle of movement building. So, some of the hardest decisions I've had to take over the years have been to decentralize the work that I've been called to do, because it's generally created an expert culture, but that expert culture becomes resistant to sharing that expertise and becomes quite kind of, not consciously, but unconsciously protective of its own stuff. And so that's been a big thing, I think, over the years.
Oh, that's fascinating. What would you say to a leader that's wanting to start? I noticed in your current work, you're working with house churches. So first off, talk about the difference between that and missional community, or the degree to which they're the same. And then talk about leaders that are wanting to lean into that direction of ministry. What advice would you give them?
Well, get somebody to help you, because it's hard to do. Again, I mean, it's just you just need somebody to walk with you in a lot of these things. I think that missional communities are to house churches, or a word that I prefer and that we're transitioning towards at Apex, the church I'm working in, the word household, because it's a better direct translation of the word oikos.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, anything that has the word church attached to it inevitably has baggage. And the baggage often is spiritual feudalism. So, the last thing we want is to have a spiritual feudal system that's broken up into 20 small feudal systems. I mean, who wants that?
So pause for a second. I think as a European, you implicitly know what a feudal system is, but just in case some of us Americans don't, would you kind of describe in detail?
Yeah, so America is predicated on the idea that they want to develop equality by making everybody an aristocrat. Europe, when it's had its various different revolutions, has tried to develop equality by making everyone a peasant. But both of those, so you give all of the wealth to the state and everybody becomes a wealthy peasant. In America, they tried another model based on a different philosophy, Adam Smith, John Locke, and a variety of others. They believed that they could build a society where everyone had an equal status as an aristocrat. So, still enshrined in American law, we have the castle law, which describes the home of an American. So the idea of us being equal in the States is a very, very different way of being equal elsewhere. The problem is that the church, when big changes have happened, tends to conserve what was there previously. The church is by nature a conservative and conserving culture. And so the church, by and large, conserved a feudal system. And the feudal system, of course, is there are very few people at the top who have ownership of everything. They have ownership of the land, they have ownership of the property, all of the stuff. And everybody lives on their property. Well, in a church, very often, even where you've got a so-called democracy operating, the people at the top, or the person at the top, is the one who, within the social contract that exists between leaders and people, is expected to feed the people, to protect the people, to provide for the people. And the people are contributing and volunteering to support that ministry. It's a classic feudal system. It's just, we don't often see it that way. And what it means is that the people who function within the system don't expect to be producers. They only expect to be consumers. And if they're going to produce anything, they only produce enough to feed themselves. So all peasants in all feudal systems tend not to produce much more than what they can eat as a family. So that model is the model that has largely been preserved in church circles. And we use the same metrics. How many people are there and how much money do they give? Those are the metrics of feudalism. How many peasants do you have? How much tax do they pay? Which, of course, is foundational to the way that America in general thinks, because taxation to the feudal lords back in Britain was the touch point that brought about the revolution. Yeah, so that whole thing is where the revolution began. It never happened in the churches. The revolution never took place in the churches. The revolution took place in the broader culture. The church preserved the older culture of the feudal system. And you can tell it's a feudal system because in every parking lot, in every church in America on Sunday, someone somewhere has this conversation. Did you get fed this week? And because they're asking that question, they are positioning themselves as a peasant in relation to a feudal lord. So what I'm saying is that the dismantling of spiritual feudalism is vital. I mean, almost everybody understands it. The Anabaptists understand it. All of the different denominations that have attempted to reform have understood it. It's incredibly resistant to change. And so if you break up a church into house churches and have just lots and lots of feudal lords, you've not particularly achieved much. You've just got lots of small churches. So how do you create the kind of biblical egalitarianism that understood that there was no difference between Jew and Gentile, male or female, slave and free? How do you create that ecosystem, that culture where you haven't realized there's another ecosystem that needs changing? That's the question. And so, we can blithely go along hoping that we're creating a new ecosystem, and what we're doing is we're just actually reforming another version of it. Does that help, Todd?
Yeah, that does help. I find that metaphor, interesting and effective. So I'm going to have to spend some time chewing on that.
Yeah, I've done a blog on it. I think there's a blog that's something like, I think it's something like American Church Revolution or something like that.
Okay.
In my series of blogs.
Okay. Hey, Michael Lewis, jump on here and ask your question, would you?
Yeah. I was just curious how you went about starting. I mean, the group you talked about of people coming together, just reading scripture. How'd you find those people? How'd you call them together into that kind of a group? How did you start it?
Yeah. The first guy was a young African-American. He's a very bright, he's kind of a young African-American intellectual who I met in a coffee shop. We began talking. He's an artist. I think he's 22. He's already been hired in Dayton as the kind of city public artist. So he does chalk paint drawings and presentations on pavements and on sidewalks on the side of buildings. Remarkable young guy. I got talking to him a couple of times. He found out that I'd written a couple of books, and then we talked further, and I said, maybe I could get you on a podcast. And so we did a podcast together. And at the end of the podcast, I said to him, look, I've been looking for some people to read the Bible with. Would you be interested in that? And he said, yeah, I'd love to do that. And I said, have you got anything what would you like to study? And immediately he said, Ecclesiastes. And I said, oh, okay. So what kind of version of the Bible do you have in mind? He said, I don't know, but there's that one written by a poet that's kind of wild. And I said, you mean the Message version? He said, yeah, I think maybe that one, yeah. So we had a Bible study together, again, where I didn't introduce any information that I knew outside of the text. And at the end of it, he said, we shared it with one other person. He said, if you would be, he didn't use this word, he used the word drawn out of Dungeons and Dragons. He said, if you would be the moderator, I think I could get some other people to get together and do this again. So that's what he did. And so, he's gone and gathered some people, and that's what we're doing on Sunday night. Basically, it's what I'm saying is go to the same coffee shops, get to know people, hear their story, and then see if the Lord will allow you to join their story.
Thank you.
Good
question, though, Micah.
Kevin, Paul, either of you guys got anything?
So did he say, will you be the dungeon master for?
Yeah, he literally did, yeah. And he said, I want the other one to be the paladin. And, it's like, I don't know. I had to go back into my memory to, I'm thinking, I don't remember what that was. But yeah.
That's funny. What do we need to see about the future of the church in North America that I haven't been asking about? Like, what do you see that we need to see about this church in North America?
I would say the church in post-COVID America is a church that needs to recognize three continuums. The continuum of the earliest church, which is the continuum of temple and household. That basically from the day of Pentecost, the default mechanism of the church is a gathering in two kinds of spaces, a public space and what the sociologists call a social space of an extended family. So it needs the continuum of the temple and the household, the continuum of the natural and the supernatural, so that we're not just kind of functional agnostics when it comes to the supernatural. I mean, you know, all evangelicals believe in supernatural life. It's just that we're functional agnostics in the sense that we just don't ever see it. So, you know, are we praying for the sick? Are we looking for miraculous intervention by God? Because it seems to be so interwoven with the experience of the New Testament church that I don't think you can avoid it as being normative for everybody. So natural, supernatural, and physical, digital. I don't think it's possible for us to function any legitimate way in the future without some understanding that we have both a physical and a digital expression of church. So those three continuums, I think, are the continuums that create the space into which the church is growing right now.
Would you drill into the middle one, natural, supernatural, a little bit and explain a little more what you mean?
I think it's very interesting that lots of people have asked me about discipleship over the years because, you know, I've written books and done conferences and all that kind of thing. And then when I say, and of course, being a disciple means doing the things that Jesus did. Because in the Great Commission, the verse that is often forgotten, teaching them to do everything I've taught you to do, is actually the Great Commission. Mm-hmm. And I said, you know, the big shock for me was that included all kinds of stuff that I assumed was the province of groups of Christians who I thought were mad. You know, I was raised in Reformed evangelical circles that assumed that Pentecostals were bonkers and that charismatics were suspect. And I'm just being honest with you. I mean, that was the environment. And the Lord had to humble me about all of those things and teach me that I was rejecting the good gifts of God because I didn't like the wrapping paper it came in. And so that whole experience of what is a disciple? If a disciple is someone who's learning to do the things that the first disciples did, I have to learn what it means to be regularly involved in praying for healing. I have to be regularly involved in spiritual warfare. I mean, I can't avoid it. It's like what they did at the beginning. So that kind of thing has been a huge, I don't know why I didn't say that as my biggest challenge. Probably the truth is that that's been my biggest challenge because, you know, I'm like most evangelicals, pretty anal retentive about all that stuff. And I've had to learn a different way of being.
So when you say it's been your biggest challenge, do you mean it's been your biggest challenge for yourself to come to grips with it, or as you come to grips with it, dealing with other people?
Both, because of the funny thing is, because I had to honestly deal with my own personal challenges, it's helped me with everybody else. Mm-hmm. Because most of the things I struggled with, they struggled with, often not quite to the same degree. Because, you know, remember, I've been trained to assume that the transfer of knowledge is basically the task of Christian ministry. Mm-hmm. And, you know, Jesus would suggest that it's a bit more than that.
Yeah, you use the term anal retentive. I'm thinking you may be describing all of us on this call and a lot of the people we all interact with. And I don't know if I should be offended or convicted.
Yeah, well,
So, all right. So let's go ahead and move toward wrapping this up. I want to give Kevin and Micah and Paul and Aviva also, please. Any final question for Mike before I move toward wrapping us up? Okay. So, Mike, I don't know how much you remember about Mission Live, but we are recruiting and training people to start new innovative churches, where in recent years we've started to develop a focus on marginalized communities. So looking to start new innovative churches in marginalized communities and missional communities, and the idea of ministering through the oikos is very central. We learned a lot of that from you. We certainly learned a lot of imagery and language from you guys. What one word of wisdom would you have for young leaders in today's world?
don't give up. Don't give up. A bit like, it's a bit of a Winston Churchill. Just don't give up. Don't ever give up. I know it's hard, and breakthrough doesn't come quickly. But if we choose to see it as a marathon, and we pace ourselves, not for a sprint, but for the long haul, and in that decide that we're not going to give up, that if we have to stop running and we can only walk, then we'll walk. And if we can't walk, then maybe we can get somewhere crawling, but we choose not to give up. I think we'll see the things that we long for and look for.
Good word. Thank you, Mike. I appreciate your time today, my friend. It's been a long time.
Well, it has been a long time, and I'm so sorry that I've been so absent-minded about my schedule, but I'm sure you
don't worry about it. We're good. We're fine. I appreciate it. I truly do.
Well, bless you, and do come and hang out with me at Discipling Culture Collective. Just have a look at that and see ways that we can connect with one another. I'd love to be in partnership with you guys.
Discipling Culture Collective, is that a website?
Yeah, and it's a way that we've created a kind of a digital ecosystem to kind of gather all of the different spaces that we're working in.
Gotcha. All right, we'll check that out. Appreciate that.
All right, brother.